The politics of climate action is well understood in Australia, with the coalition intent on scrapping the carbon tax and Labor and the Greens suggesting this is evidence that the Abbott government isn't committed to reducing the country's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Britain's longest-serving Environment Minister, Lord Deben, has entered the Australian debate. He's a Tory and he's on Labor's side. Lord Deben is the former chairman of the Conservative Party and he now heads the UK's Independent Committee on Climate Change. He's issued a statement claiming the repeal of the carbon tax will push Australia backwards in addressing the challenges of global warming, and he's accused Tony Abbott of recklessly endangering the world's future. Lord Deben is in London. Welcome to you. You're scathing of Tony Abbott's climate change policies, saying the Australian government appears to be more concerned with advancing its own short-term political interests. What gives you that impression?
Well, the fact is, almost all the rest of the world is now fighting climate change, from Mexico to South Korea and China to South Africa. They are moving ahead, doing more and tougher things. Only Australia and, to some extent, Canada, but particularly Australia, is actually going backwards. I'm not, of course, fighting for a particular answer. If Mr Abbott wanted to get rid of the climate charge and then have something else instead of the carbon tax, then that would be perfectly all right as long as it was going to deliver the same thing. But Australia now has miserable targets. The idea that you're only going to decrease your emissions by 5% by the year 2020 is way out of line of any other advanced country, and that's a very sad thing.
OK, we need to unpack a little of what you've just said, but first of all, your first assumption presumes nothing is going to replace the carbon tax, but that's quite incorrect.
Well, I know what is going to replace it, but the effort is not going to be sufficient to do what Australia needs to do if it is going to be parallel with what is happening in Europe, what's happening in the United States even now. And the reason that I think it's right for me to say these things is that Britain is changing Australia's climate just as Australia is changing our climate. The difference is we are doing a great deal. We are going to reduce all our emissions on 1990 by 30% in a period in which Australia is talking about a miserable 5% or a bit over that.
OK. You've said that essentially direct action, which will replace the carbon tax, is not going to do the job. Isn't it a little premature to say that, given the system hasn't even commenced in Australia?
Well, you always have to look at the efficacy by making parallels, and all I can say is I can't find anybody in the world that thinks that this package will produce a serious reduction in Australia's emissions. It's part of a package, perfectly reasonable bit of a package. But when you compare that with what Mr Obama is now doing, if you compare that with what Conservative Mrs Angela Merkel is doing, if you compare that with what Mexico is doing, it's just not enough for Australia to be playing her proper part. And I'm proud of Australia. I'm an English speaker. I'm a Conservative. And I hate to see that wonderful nation fall behind and leave it to other people.
Let's look at some of the comparisons you mentioned, because analysis from our Department of Foreign Affairs here in Australia that gives the same baseline across countries, because you'd be aware that our baseline is 2000. The 5% is a reduction on 2000 levels. When that baseline is moved so that all countries have a baseline of 2005, that 5% reduction in Australia comes up to 12%, which compares quite favourably and to international comparisons of the US with 17% and even the EU, which on 2005 levels, the emission reductions target is between 13 and 24%. So it's not quite as low as you suggest.
Oh, well, if you fiddle the figures, of course, if you change the baselines,
it's not about fiddling.
we can all do that.
With respect,
well, it is. I mean,
no. Well, with respect,
let's,
how can you compare? Sorry, let me just finish this point, because how can you compare from 1990 levels to 2000 levels, 2005 levels? I mean, Australia's emissions reduction target comes from 2000 levels, whereas the US comes from 2005. What I'm saying is, when you level the field and put it all on a baseline of 2005, Australia's emissions reductions look better.
Well, of course, if you choose the year where it makes it look best, you don't go back to 1990 like the other countries outside the United States. If you don't do the international figures and the international comparisons, then, of course, you can make these figures look different. But all I'm saying is, very simply, the carbon tax was beginning to reduce emissions. It could be seen by international observers as reducing emissions significantly. A 5% target by 2020 is out of kilter, even if you choose the most favourable base that you like with the rest of the world. And Australia is changing the rest of the world's climate as we are changing it. If it doesn't join in, if it isn't working, if it stands on its own and says we don't want any of the measures that the whole of the rest of the world, almost without exception, more than 80% of the world's emitters are doing, then Australia is saying, you're all wrong, we don't really believe in the urgency of climate change. And we know, I've had the meetings with Mr. Abbott, he doesn't have the view about climate change that conservatives throughout the rest of the world do, which it's the biggest threat to the future of the world that we have.
What view did he convey to you?
Well, a view which was that this didn't matter, that it wasn't important, that it was in no way a priority. If you talk to Mr. Cameron, he will say to you, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, he will say this is the most important thing that faces the world, the biggest danger. If you talk to Mr. Obama, he will say the same thing. Talk to Mrs. Merkel, she'll say the same thing. Mr. Abbott, unfortunately, I don't know why this should be, because the science is now fixed. The science is now as strong linking climate change with human activity as it is linking cancer with smoking. And yet he still will not stand up and say, I accept that, and I am going to make sure that Australia plays its proper part.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the carbon price in Australia was already working. Where's your evidence for that?
Well, all the exterior evidence, as I understand it, and I can only rely on that, is saying that emissions in Australia were beginning to fall as a result of it. But
can I give you the statistics?
Well, you can give me any statistic, but I'd like to finish the sentence. The sentence is this. I am not arguing that you should have a carbon tax rather than something else. What I am arguing is that to abolish the carbon tax without putting something effective in its place, something which the world would see as you playing your part, but instead going to Canada and trying to put together an alliance of people that are going to undermine everything that people are doing, that means that Australia is not stepping up to the mark. And so either you leave the carbon tax to see whether over longer periods, because frankly it's only been going for a short period of time, so what the figures are arguable. But if you either leave it for that time or bring in something which is independently analysed. So instead of actually abolishing the Climate Change Committee, you should have an independent committee, as we have in Britain, which can say to the government, this is not going to work, and can indeed insist that the government takes actions which do work. Why has he abolished the independent body? If he really believes this, why has he abolished the independent body, and its free independent alternative says that his proposals will not deliver? No independent group supports Mr. Abbott's contention that he is going to replace this carbon tax with something that will work as well. Nobody, not a single person.
It would appear that no one can really tell us what does work so far internationally, because you cite the EU, for instance, as one of those in the world taking this matter more seriously than Tony Abbott. And yet the European ETS is a mess. The price has collapsed from €20 in 2005 to €5 today. It's been as low as €2.75. Corruption's rife. There's an excess of permits, so the incentive to reduce emissions simply isn't there. In fact, Jeff Schwartz of the International Emissions Trading Association says the EU ETS is an example of exactly what not to do.
Well, I quite agree that we've got to change it, because it was produced at a time when there was no recession, and therefore it thought that there would be a great deal more activity than there was, and it needs to be changed, and the EU has taken the measures to change it. But it hasn't been abolished, it has been improved, and the same can be said about the carbon tax. If you don't think it's the right one, if you don't think it's in the right place, you improve it. You don't turn round and point at other people and say, well, your particular answer in that particular part isn't working, but it's working in the United Kingdom. We've met our targets in the United Kingdom, more than met our targets in the first 5 years. I've just produced the report in which we've looked at the British government targets, tough targets, and we've more than met them. And indeed, we've so much more than met them that the government has agreed that the advantage that we've got will not be counted. So we'll still have to do even better in the next carbon budget. So the difference is this. In Britain, we have an independent body which is apart from party politics, which sets the targets, sets the budget, and independently assesses how well the government has done. Mr. Abbott has got rid of his independent group. He won't have independent assessment. Nobody outside his party thinks that his policy is going to deliver, and he will not listen to the rest of the world. That seems to me to be very sad, because Australia is a great nation, an English-speaking nation that ought to be leading the world instead of going backwards.
Let's look at the difference between the UK and Australia, because here in Australia, mining accounts for 10% of our economy. We need to be cautious, don't we, about protecting jobs and the national wealth. In the UK, the financial services sector represents 10% of the economy. They don't produce much in the way of carbon emissions.
Well, there's another 90% in both cases, so it's not actually a terribly helpful comparison. And the fact of the matter is that in Britain, for example, a whole range of businesses produce large amounts of emissions. Merely our transport produces a huge amount of emissions, and we are a much more populous country than Australia. You have to look at it in the round. The real problem is that if Australia or any other country doesn't fight climate change, then first of all, the future is very bleak for the next generation. And secondly, it won't get the new jobs. Because we're fighting climate change, almost all the new jobs of this government, which has in fact increased our employment very significantly, come from the green sector. Australia is cutting itself off from that, and that's a great pity. So don't just put 10% against 10%, accept that the vast amount of Australian production can in fact be more efficient, can reduce its emissions, can actually make way for more green jobs. And many of the new ways of producing energy are increasingly competitive. Both wind and solar are increasingly competitive. So it's peculiar that that Australia is not going down that route, where even Saudi Arabia is beginning to change over to solar. There is so much Australia can do. You're such a fortunate country. You should be saying to yourself, God has given us this great country. We don't want to damage the climate of this country. We don't want to have yet another year of the worst heat periods that we've ever had. We actually want to begin to play our part in improving the climate of the world and getting more jobs from the green industries which are flourishing in the United Kingdom.
You say that we're not doing our part in Australia. How can you accuse Tony Abbott of that and of recklessly endangering the world with his policies when he is in fact spending $2.5 billion on direct abatement in the Australian economy?
Look, in the time of the highest recession, the most difficult period of recession that we've ever had, we've just been spending $6.7 billion on one aspect of this, which is the decarbonisation of our electricity system. The countries around the world are spending very large sums of money, and to talk about that as if that's the answer to the whole thing is just not acceptable. The real issue is this. If people outside and inside Australia believed that Mr. Abbott took climate change seriously, was going to international conferences to try to play Australia's part in leading the world, that he actually thought this was important and not, as is rumoured, thinks it's all rubbish, to use an English word, then we would be much more sympathetic with the views that he's putting forward. But we all know he and his government do not take this seriously, where the rest of the world, as to 80+% of emitters, are taking it so seriously that we find it very upsetting that Australia should be slapping us in the face and saying, we don't care about the climate, you can get on with it, we are not doing our part.
We are running out of time, but one last question on the fact that you did just previously admit that the European emissions trading scheme hasn't worked so far. It has had a negligible effect, as far as we can tell, on emissions in the European Union. And you also cited Mexico, for instance, where I note that the carbon price is $1. Is there an example anywhere in the world of where an emissions trading scheme has worked?
Well, I mean, take British Columbia, where they have a carbon tax, and that has had a huge and direct effect. But you're only picking two bits. In the European Union, we're doing a huge amount more than the EU ETS. That's only part of what we're doing. We're doing a vast amount. So you get, for example, Germany, which is now producing every day 30% of its energy requirements from renewables, and at the best part, more than 60%. This is only a tiny part of what we're doing. It ought to be more. We want it to be more effective, and we are tightening it very considerably. The same thing is in, if you take Mexico. Mexico has set up an independent way of ensuring the government does do these things. And I come back to it. Why did Mr. Abbott actually get rid of his independent body? Why did he sack it right from the beginning? It is because he is not prepared to listen to outside people independently saying to him, this is what needs to be done. What you are suggesting will not meet the requirements. And so the Climate Change Committee that he got rid of, and which is now supported by public subscription, makes it perfectly clear that what Australia is now doing is to go backwards. And I'm only echoing what they're saying with the evidence that we have in Britain from our independent committee.
Lord Deben, we're out of time. I thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.